Hello, everyone. My name is Crane Hassel, I'm the Senior Director of Threat Research at Agari. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about the BEC threat landscape, sort of how it's evolved over the past year or so, and how we can use different types of intelligence techniques to better combat this emerging and growing threat. Now, because this is a virtual session and I'm recording this in advance, if anyone has any questions about the content that I'm covering today, please feel free to ask it at any time. I'll be there in person with you guys, so I'll be able to answer any questions throughout this entire presentation. So with that, let's get started. So before we really dive into this, let's level set a little bit about what we're talking about when we're talking about business email compromise. So BEC, as it's commonly referred to, can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. The context I'll be using it in today is essentially business email compromise is a spear phishing attack that involves the impersonation of a trusted individual or other organization to trick a person into making a financial transaction or sending other types of sensitive materials. So when we're talking about BEC, that's really what we're going to be talking about today. So how big of a problem is BEC? So since you're at this presentation, I'm assuming you probably know how big of an issue business email compromise has become over the past few years. And just to sort of demonstrate that, from an FBI Internet Crime Complaint Center alert, IC3 alert from the end of 2019, in that alert, they said that BEC had caused more than $26 billion of financial loss between the middle of 2016 and October of 2019. And when you look at that on a per month basis, that essentially equates to about $708 million of loss every single month. To put that in another perspective, in the IC3 report that came out earlier this year that looked at all of the cybercrime losses from 2020, in that report, about 41% of all cybercrime losses was attributed to some form of BEC, of business email compromise. So that just shows you how much of a problem BEC has become over the past couple of years and how much it continues to grow. So why is BEC and why has BEC become such a big problem? Well, there are three primary reasons for this. One is traditional defenses that have been around for decades at this point have primarily focused on more technically sophisticated types of attacks. Things like malware, ransomware, things like that. Those are the types of cyber attacks that a lot of email defenses have gotten really good at defending against. What they haven't gotten very good at defending against are less technically sophisticated, more pure social engineering attacks, which is where a lot of cyber attackers are going today. So that's reason number one why BEC has become such a bigger problem. Reason number two is when you look at business email compromise and from a business perspective, the return on investment, the ROI for these types of attacks is significantly greater than other types of cyber attacks. One of the things that we had been talking about for a long time, and we'll talk about this a little bit later on in the presentation, is at some point we expected the Eastern European and the Russian cyber criminals to start thinking to themselves, why am I spending all of this time and money on hiring developers for my malware and setting up infrastructure when I could just send someone an email, tell them to send me money, and they'll do it? The return is so much better there. And as we've seen over the past couple of years, we're starting to see more of those sophisticated actors get into the BEC space. And the third reason that BEC has become such a big problem is, at its core, social engineering is extremely effective. As long as human beings have been on this earth for thousands and thousands of years now, and as long as we've been interacting with one another, we've been social engineering each other. The only difference is now the tools that we're using to con each other are the internet, our computers. Instead of doing it face-to-face, instead of doing it over the phone, instead of doing it through the mail, we now have a digital capability to social engineer each other. The same concepts that have been used for thousands of years are still being used today. The only difference is the medium by which those attacks are taking place. So let's also look at the BEC ecosystem and how it's really a much bigger than what we've become accustomed to. A lot of the research that my team has done at Agari has been looking at the actors behind these BEC attacks. And what we found is that the same actors that are running BEC scams are also running dozens of other types of fraudulent activities. Things like credential phishing, unemployment fraud, real estate fraud, the classic Nigerian prince scams, romance scams, lottery scams. All of these types of attacks and scams and fraudulent activity can all be traced back to the same relative group of actors in places like West Africa. To put it into some additional context, let's look at some of the numbers that came out earlier this year in the FBI's IC3 report. Now, all of the different types of fraudulent activity that I have highlighted here in purple, based on all of the research that my team has done, we can confidently say that a lot of this activity and all of these losses can be attributed to similar types of actors, primarily coming from places like West Africa. And while BEC was associated with $1.8, $1.9 billion of financial loss in 2020, when we calculate all of the different types of fraudulent activities that are associated with similar actors, then you start getting into more than $4 billion, or 70% of all of the cybercrime losses can all be linked to a relatively small population of actors in a quite small place in the world. This also, to look at it in a different way, we released a report a few years ago on a group that we called Scattered Canary. Now, our Scattered Canary report was very interesting in that it gave us a really good look at how one of these West African BEC groups evolves into essentially a sole proprietorship from a business perspective into a larger cybercrime enterprise with numerous dozens of actors helping out with day-to-day activities. And as you can see, as it evolved over time, the group got into more and more types of scams. And at the end, they were running dozens of different types of scams concurrently to one another. So while we may say that these groups are BEC groups, we know that while they're running BEC scams, they're also running romance scams. They're also running advanced fee fraud scams. They're also running SBA loan fraud scams and other types of fraudulent activity concurrently to one another. Now, this really came into the forefront last year when COVID-19 hit all of us, and especially the US government started passing different types of support to help out with a lot of the impact from COVID-19. Unemployment fraud was one of the big components to that. And we can see that Scattered Canary, as we just discussed, was doing a lot of BEC activity. We also saw that they were also one of the primary groups that were associated with a lot of the early COVID-19 unemployment fraud that was going on. And looking at some statistics from earlier this year, at this point, we're looking at more than $36 billion has been lost to unemployment fraud on an estimated capacity. I've even heard numbers going up to almost $200 billion being lost to unemployment fraud over the past year. So the same groups that are associated with BEC are also being associated with things like unemployment fraud and making a massive impact on a financial scale. So that's a little background about business email compromise. Let's look about the financial components of BEC, because like most other types of cybercrime, BEC is financially motivated. And because it's financially motivated, the money side of these attacks is very important to understand. And then you can understand how the entire attack chain works and then how to prevent it at the end of the day. So there are three primary cash out methods for BEC attacks. And the one that probably most people are familiar with are fake wire transfers. Take a BEC actor who is impersonating the CEO of a company, asking an employee to make a payment to a supposed vendor who needs who's where the money is due. See some examples on that on the right-hand side of the screen here. And this is really where CEO fraud, CEO impersonation scams, BEC really took root around 2014, 2015. Now, the upsides of wire transfer attacks are significantly higher payouts. When we look at the average amount being requested in a wire transfer BEC attack, it's ranged anywhere between about $50,000 on average to upwards of $100,000 on average in any given month over the past year and a half. So they can make a lot of money for any of these successful attacks. They can also develop very sophisticated pretexts, reasons why this money is being due, and we'll look at some of those pretexts here on the next few slides. The downsides to wire transfer attacks and why they aren't as common really as they used to be, and we'll see what's sort of taken their place here in a little bit, are the payouts, the amount of time it takes to receive the money once it goes through the entire laundering chain takes a long time, and there are a lot of possibilities of that money flow getting interrupted somewhere along the way. And then it also requires money mules. In order to receive the funds, a lot of these actors are coming from places like West Africa, and they aren't going to be receiving the money directly. So they need to have an intermediary in the locations where the targets are, and they're going to be the ones who then receive the funds, pass it on to another actor, who then passes it on to another actor, so on down the line until it finally makes its way back to the scammer. And there's a lot, again, you have to sort of rely on another actor in order to do that. So some of the things that we've seen over the past year, and especially more recently in the wire transfer BEC space, are some interesting pretexts that are being used by actors that we haven't seen before. In this example, we've started seeing this at the end of 2020, and this is essentially using a capital call payment as a pretext for a payment that's supposed to be due for someone to send a wire transfer. So for those of you who don't know, a capital call payment is a payment that is supposed to be due for some sort of investment. And in those investments, once they are ready to close, that the investor will then request money from the other investors, and that all goes into a fund or a real estate investment or something like that. In this case, they're using those similar types of pretexts here, asking for about $42,000 for an investment that's supposed to be due. We've seen these types of payments go up to upwards of $1 million. And so you can see that because they are, investment themed, they would be able to ask for more money than they might from other types of wire transfer attacks. Other pretexts we've seen that are interesting more recently, in this case, it's meant to look like an acquisition is taking place, and the attacker is initially impersonating the CEO of a company and asking the target, which is usually going to be someone on the finance team, an accounts payable specialist, to get in touch with another persona who is actually impersonating a legitimate attorney at someone like KPMG. And as you can see from the different samples we have here on the screen, you can see that there's a handoff that happens there, who's then asking the target employee to make a relatively sizable payment that's supposed to be due for a supposed acquisition that's taking place of an Asian-based company. And these are the types of sophisticated pretexts that we see becoming more and more frequent in the wire transfer BEC space, which not only makes them more successful because they're putting a little bit more time into creating more legitimate looking emails, but it also allows them to ask for more money as they create these more sophisticated pretexts. So the next type of cash out method that we see in BEC attacks are payroll diversions. Essentially, in this case, actors are asking, impersonating a CEO or some other executive at a company, targeting someone on the human resources team and asking them to update their direct deposit account that they're using for payroll. Now, the upsides to these are, one, there's sort of a delayed detection here. People only get paid once, usually maybe once every 2 weeks. And if the direct deposit doesn't come in, it could be a matter of days, if not a matter of weeks, before someone actually realizes that they didn't get paid. What's also a benefit to payroll diversion attacks are the types of mule accounts that are being used here. Now, usually in wire transfer BEC attacks, most of the accounts that we see receiving the funds are going to be normal checking commercial accounts, right? With payroll diversion attacks, what we generally see are actually prepaid card accounts being used. Things like GoBank and Green Dot cards being used to receive these funds. And that allows the ability for the laundering process to take place a little bit more quickly than they would in other types of methods. Now, the downsides to payroll diversion attacks are the amounts are unknown. to the actors. The actors generally don't know how much an employee is going to be making. So while they usually are going to be impersonating executives, so the thought process there is that they're probably going to be making a significant amount of money. They don't actually know how much money they're going to be making if one of these attacks is being successful. And then also, there's a relatively limited population of targets out there. Not only are they, generally only going to be impersonating the executives, but they also have to target someone that's generally going to be on the HR team, which is not a large number of employees generally in most companies. Now, when we look at what happened in the payroll diversion threat landscape in 2020, we saw something very interesting happening. So in the first 6 months of 2020, we saw a pretty significant decline in overall payroll diversion attacks. And the reason for this were two primary reasons. One, the mule accounts that were being used changed. We saw one of the primary organizations being used to receive a lot of payroll diversion attacks up until sort of the late part of 2019, really put some very good mitigation procedures in place, which caused a lot of payroll diversion actors to start looking for other ways to receive their funds. And so as they were doing this, we saw them testing out different types of accounts to be used for receiving payroll diversion funds. What we also saw in the beginning of 2019, and what I mentioned earlier, was because of COVID-19, we saw a significant amount of unemployment fraud and other types of fraud being because of the amount of money that was put out to stem the impacts of COVID-19. And so a lot of the actors involved in things like payroll diversion actually temporarily pivoted to things like unemployment fraud right after something like the CARES Act was being passed. And a lot of the mule accounts that were being used to receive payroll diversion funds were also now being used to receive unemployment fraud. So a lot of prepaid card accounts, groups like Scattered Canary almost exclusively used green dot accounts to receive unemployment fraud. So a lot of those mule accounts were being used for other types of fraudulent activity. Now that really changed after we hit July of last year. In July of 2020, we really saw the payroll diversion ecosystem bottom out. About only 3% of all of the BEC attacks we saw in July of last year were payroll diversion attacks. But as you can see on the screen here, month over month throughout the entire rest of this entire second half of 2020, we saw an increase every single month in payroll diversion. And it's now almost gotten to the point where it's eclipsed wire transfer attacks again. So the third primary cash out method for BEC attacks are gift cards. And gift cards are now the number one cash out method for BEC attacks, and the reason for this is really, really interesting. As you can see on the pie chart here, more than a half of all of the BEC attacks we saw in 2020 requested gift cards as a form of payment. Now, the reason for this, there are a couple different reasons for this. One, these gift cards are non-reversible. And we'll look at this on the next slide. Once they are sent to the attacker, they are laundered very, very quickly, and the money hits the scammers' bank accounts. There's no need for those middlemen or money mules. As we talked with the wire transfer attacks, one of the reasons that there's a downside of that is that they have to use those money mules. In this case, there is no middleman that needs to be used in these scams. And then the third reason that gift cards have become so prominent, I think this is probably one of the main reasons, is that there's a much larger population of potential employees that can be targeted in these attacks compared to other types of BEC attacks. Now, while something like a wire transfer BEC attack is looking, to target someone on the finance team, or payroll diversion attacks are looking to target someone on the human resources team, gift card attacks can target any employee at an individual company. We've seen BEC campaigns requesting gift cards that have targeted 50, 60, 70 employees at a single organization in one single campaign. And they're not, these actors are not looking for a huge success rate, but the more of these emails they can send out, the higher the chance of one of them or a handful of them becoming successful. Now, the downsides to gift card attacks are the payouts are significantly smaller. We're generally looking between $1,000 and $1,500 for a successful gift card BEC attack. So that's a fraction of what they're getting in wire transfer attacks. And then also the ploys that they're using are generally going to be less convincing. So if you look at an example here on the right-hand side of the screen here, a lot of the themes we see in gift card attacks are going to be looking at things like, I need to get rewards for employees or gifts for customers. That's generally the themes we see, which I think make a little bit of sense. But as the attack unfolds and you start saying, well, then you have to go to the store and get me a bunch of Apple iTunes gift cards, take pictures of them individually, and text them back to me, then it starting to put the potential to raise a lot of red flags as you go along. And so that makes that sort of the pretext and the ploys a little bit more difficult as they unfold. And so the last thing I'll talk about here is what drives the BEC engine today. So there are two primary things that drive BEC today. One are the prepaid cards that I've talked about before. The picture here on the right-hand side of the screen is a picture I took at my local Walmart. That is what I essentially call the mule account box. This is where a lot of those prepaid cards are purchased and are then used to receive a lot of different types of fraudulent funds from BEC attacks. We've also seen the rise of apps like Cash App being really integral in the BEC ecosystem, because that is a big place where a lot of the funds are now being moved out of the country. One of the upsides to Cash App and why it's so attractive to BEC actors is that it allows for someone to convert funds into cryptocurrency very quickly. Speaking of cryptocurrency, other sites like Paxful are also being used more frequently in BEC attacks. At the bottom of the screen here, this is the laundering chain of how a gift cards are laundered almost exclusively in almost all the groups that we've tracked, all the BEC groups we've tracked. This is essentially the process by which the gift cards are laundered very quickly from the time they're received from the victim to a Nigerian bank account. So let's pivot here a little bit to the future of BEC. What do we see in the BEC threat landscape moving forward? Well, one is the types of BEC attacks we're seeing. And one of the biggest threats in BEC is what we call vendor email compromise. Vendor email compromise is essentially a hybrid of a credential phishing attack and identity deception CEO impersonation attack that allows an attacker to create a very sophisticated, realistic looking email targeting a vendor or supplier's customers. What happens in a VEC attack is, first, the attacker will send out a credential phishing campaign, generally going to be something that's going to be impersonating Office 365, Dropbox, DocuSign, Adobe, things like that, and will compromise a number of mailboxes. The attacker will then identify high-profile mailboxes, high-value mailboxes there that are going to be involved in some way, shape, or form with payments. And once those high-value mailboxes have been identified, the attackers will then sit on those mailboxes and collect intelligence from them to identify things like when payments are due, what customers a vendor or supplier has, what do invoices look like, and they'll steal copies of those invoices. What do normal communication patterns look like? And after a few weeks, if not sometimes a few months, the attackers will then use that intelligence to send completely realistic looking emails to that vendor or supplier's customers requesting payment for a payment that's actually due. The only difference is the account number where the payment is supposed to be sent is going to change. And they might use a replica invoice there for that. And so a lot of the BEC attacks that we see in the news today are going to be these vendor email compromise attacks. And these are the biggest threat to enterprises really all over the world when it comes to BEC. Now, the next thing that we've seen has become much more common in the past few months are something that we call aging report BEC attacks. These are very interesting attacks. And what happens, for those who don't know what an aging report is, so an aging report is a financial report that essentially lists all of the outstanding payments that are due for a vendor or supplier. It lists off, how much is actually due, how overdue it is, and then it also shows who the points of contact are for each customer and their contact information. So what we've seen happen more recently are attackers are, instead of requesting a wire transfer to be paid to a supposed vendor, they're impersonating a CEO and asking for a copy of the most up-to-date aging report. And as you can see at the bottom of the screen here, this looks like a sample of what you might see in one of these aging reports. And what the attackers will do is they'll use all of this information to then send an email to all of the customers on this list asking for payments for those outstanding balances. And you can see an example of what one of those emails might look like on the right-hand side of the screen. Now, essentially, these are the exact same concepts and tactics that we see in normal vendor email compromise attacks. The only difference is here, there's no compromise that's required in order to make these successful, but all the steps are essentially the same. And one of the interesting things is, so there's a group that we call Ancient Tortoise that has been involved in aging report attacks for about 18 months now, based on our research. And what's really interesting is while this group is still involved with a lot of these attacks, we've started to see more and more BEC actors with different types of tactics starting to use aging report pretext as well. And in January of 2021, more than 10% of all of the BEC attacks that we saw were actually requesting aging reports. So we can see that this is becoming much more popular in the BEC sphere. Something else we've seen more recently is more sophisticated actors entering the BEC space. This is an article from 2020 looking at North Korean state actors actually being involved in BEC attacks. While they were also compromising infrastructure for other types of attacks, they were also using a lot of that intelligence to commit things like vendor email compromise attacks as well. So we can see this is becoming, what I mentioned at the very beginning of this presentation. We're starting to see a lot of these actors starting to think to themselves, there's a lot of money to be made here in the BEC space. Let's try our hand at it. BEC actors are also becoming more geographically diverse. Traditionally, a lot of BEC activity has been coming from places primarily in Nigeria, but also places like South Africa. What we've seen over the past year or so is starting to see a global footprint for BEC actors. More recently, we've seen a lot of sophisticated actors coming out of places like Russia, and we'll talk about an example of that here in just a second, and also places like Israel. We've seen a number of Israeli actors using some pretty sophisticated tactics in the BEC space they're being quite successful. And then also some of the other more Western countries out there, like the US and Great Britain. And some of the research that we published in 2020, we saw that upwards of a quarter of all of the BEC actors that we engaged with on a daily basis were actually based out of the US. So I mentioned those Russian actors, and one of the groups I want to point out here is a group that we call Cosmic Links. This is a group that we published a report on in July of 2020, and it's very important, I think, this report, because it is, as far as we can tell, the first instance of a Russian-specific business email compromise group. Now, some of the things about Cosmic Links that's really interesting is that their attack tactics are extremely well written. You can see an example of one of their initial emails here on the right-hand side of the screen. And you can see there's a lot of context in there. There's a lot of information in there, and it's written very, very well. Most of their attacks are written in English. And as you can see, from a native English speaker, this is almost perfect spelling and grammar. They also take the time to understand their target's infrastructure. They want to understand, do they have an effective DMARC policy in place? And if an organization does have an effective DMARC policy in place, they actually adapt their tactics accordingly, depending on whether they can directly spoof an executive's email or not. Their emails are M&A themed, so similar to an example I showed a little bit earlier. They're looking at a mergers and acquisition of a company based out of Asia, and you can see that they actually use what we call a dual impersonation scheme. So they initially impersonate the CEO of a company, and then they'll hand the target employee off to another persona who is impersonating an actual attorney, generally based out of a UK law firm. And you can see what's really interesting. The follow-up emails that this group sends, again, look very legitimate, look like they could be coming from a legitimate attorney. They even use a lot of the information from the law firm's website and the picture of the lawyer in the signature of their emails. Now, similar to most of the other BEC groups that we track, Cosmic Links is what we would consider to be industry agnostic. So they're not going after a specific industry, but it's pretty clear that they have a specific target profile in place. And those are large, multinational, global organizations. We've identified targets of Cosmic Links in 53 different countries at this point. A lot of these organizations are Fortune 500 companies or Global 2000 companies. And in addition to these big, large global organizations, instead of also going after, lower level financial employees, the targets of these attacks are also senior level executives. Similar to a lot of the other BEC groups that we track, it's pretty clear that Cosmic Links is identifying targets based on their title. And 75% of all of the targets that we've seen from Cosmic Links are either managing directors, vice presidents, or general managers. So we've gone over a little bit of what BEC is, how it's changed over in 2020, how it's evolving in 2021. But let's look at how we can combat this type of activity. So one of the really interesting aspects of BEC is that unlike things like credential phishing or things like malware or malicious payload attacks, it actually requires interaction with the victim in order to be successful. So that gives us a really good opportunity to get in the middle of these attacks and start collecting intelligence to better understand how they operate and how we can prevent them. And this is what we call active defense. And our definition of active defense is essentially interacting with an attack or an attacker for the purpose of collecting intelligence. Now, this is not the same thing as hacking back, which has been sort of a buzzword that we've seen in recent years. It's not deploying malicious payloads on an attacker's infrastructure. It's essentially just interacting with that attack for the purposes of collecting additional intelligence. And that can involve things like engaging with BEC actors, seeding credential phishing sites, embedding beacons in our communications, and setting up honeypots that allows us to collect various types of intelligence. At a small scale, this is how it works. A BEC actor may say, "Can you send a payment to a new vendor?" We say, "Yes." They may say, "Can you change my payroll information?" Our response, "Sure." "Can you go buy $3,000 in iTunes gift cards?" Of course we can. "Would you mind sending me all of the W-2s for all of our employees?" Yeah, not a problem at all. "And can you send me something like an up-to-date aging report?" Right away, we will get right on that. At its core, that's essentially how active defense works. But let's walk through sort of another overview of just demonstrate in more concrete terms about how this works. So this is an email from a BEC actor who's impersonating a CEO who's asking for a payment that's supposed to be sent out and saying, "What information do you need to process this payment? Please get back to me ASAP." We say, "Not a problem at all. Please send me the beneficiary account details and I'll get right on it." They, of course, send us the details for the first mule account we're going to be collecting, so we know where they want the money to be sent. And so this is sort of piece number one of the intelligence collection. We know where they want money to be sent. We also know how this attack is going to unfold. But of course, we're not going to send them any money. So our first response is going to be like, "I'm actually getting a message that says this account isn't able to receive incoming transfers at this time. Could you check on that to see if anything's wrong?" And of course, something may or may not be wrong with the account, but of course they send us with another option for us to use. And so this is the second mule account that we've now collected in this attack. And in this case, we're going to send them back a fake receipt being like, "Perfect, the payment is out. Here's your confirmation. By the way, if there are any other payments that you need me to take care of, please just let me know as soon as possible." To which they appreciate the payment being sent out. They say that they've seen it and said, there is another payment I actually need you to make. Here are the details for that one. And so we now have another mule account. And this just goes on and on and on, really until these engagements extinguish themselves. Sometimes this could take 24 hours. Sometimes it could take multiple months. We've had some engagements that have lasted almost 3 months, and we've collected dozens of mule accounts from these actors. And while the mule accounts aren't the only component that we're interested in, we're also interested in other pieces of information as well. Really, the best thing about these active defense engagements is it allows us to understand how one of these attacks were to unfold if it was to be successful. Now, similar to those response-based attacks, we can use a lot of the same concepts for credential phishing. So this helps us better understand what happens when after an account has been compromised. We can set up our own infrastructure, seed credentials into that infrastructure based on the infrastructure we've sent out, seed those accounts into credential phishing sites, and then look at the back end and see what happens. We can see how quickly an account's been compromised. Where is it being accessed from? How is it being accessed? And then what does the actor also want to do with those accounts? Do they want to send additional emails out from that account? Will they then pivot to other types of infrastructure? Do they want to go to OneDrive or SharePoint? Or do they want to set up forwarding rules on those accounts? Again, it helps us understand what happens after one of these attacks is successful. So at its core, how does active defense help? So again, as I've mentioned, it allows us to see the entire BEC attack cycle. We can observe BEC actor tactics that we wouldn't be able to see if we were just doing passive collection. It helps us understand fraudulent accounts. We can optimize our defenses based on the strategic intelligence we're collecting. And at its core, it helps us mitigate risk from BEC attacks. We can also use active defense to disrupt the BEC ecosystem. We can, based on what we collect, we can send the validated email accounts to email providers to get those shut down. We can provide the mule accounts to places like FSISAC and other banks to get those reviewed and mitigated as quickly as possible. And then we could also collaborate with law enforcement to help supplement investigations that they may be conducting. That's pretty much the end of my presentation. As far as applications of how you can apply this information, I hope you learned some things. Some things like asking questions like, do I have systems today equipped to defend against identity deception attack? Do I have effective internal processes developed to prevent unauthorized wire transfers? And am I able to run an active defense program in-house, or is this something that I should outsource to another organization? If anyone would like more information about BEC and intelligence that my team has collected about the BEC ecosystem, please you can go to agari.com/active defense, and you can also go to acid.agari.com to download any of the previous BEC intelligence reports that my team has published. Thank you very much for attending my presentation today. I hope you guys learned something, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.